talking about by talking about going around the narrow gauge circle. The narrow gauge circle was basically a loop out of Denver and back, which initially was standard gauge. You took an overnight sleeping car train from Denver either to Salida uh, or to Alamosa, and then you changed to narrow gauge network and continued around southwest Colorado. Now, originally, all of these lines had been narrow gauge. The Rio Grande was built as a 3-foot narrow gauge railway, but began even by the 1890s to standard gauge its main lines. It never got around to, mostly for financial reasons, completing the process, and had still some 400 miles plus of narrow gauge lines in southwestern Colorado as late as the 1930s. The Loop Tour, which again they promoted for so many decades, ceased to be available after about 1936 when the first abandonment of passenger services on the route began, but it was there for a long time and it was a remarkable experience. Rio Grande was also very good at putting out promotional material. This is a large format magazine that they put out for decades of hand-done paintings of the Rio Grande's main lines in Colorado, most famous being at the time probably the Royal Gorge line on the right there with the highest suspension bridge in the world hanging above it. But at Salida, Colorado, about 200 miles or so west of Denver, you could change from the standard gauge overnight sleeping car train to the Shivano, a named train in the narrow gauge system, at least from 1936 to 1940, a named train. It had a power car on it, and it went over the towering 10,842-foot Marshall Pass. The train had always been number 315 and 316. Just near the end of it, it got a name. Now, this was the original main line of the Rio Grande Railroad. Neither the Moffett route, which the Amtrak California Zephyr follows today, nor the Tennessee Pass Royal Gorge line were the original main lines. The original main line went over Marshall Pass, and it was a remarkable feat of engineering, not least because it actually wasn't staggeringly steep in most places. Although there were little bits of 4% grade on Marshall Pass, most of it was 1 to 2% with 3% grade up near the summit. It was abandoned in 1953 and torn up in 1955. But it lasted a long time after the narrow gauge had become inconsequential to the Rio Grande overhaul because of important mines at Crested Butte and Baldwin above Gunnison on the west side of the pass. These are pictures I took on the auto road, which opened up in 1962 on what had been the railway grade. And you can still drive this today with any passenger car as long as you're reasonably careful and safe. Don't drive too fast. At the summit, there was a snow shed so that the trains could be gotten out of the weather. The shed, my machine is going bonkers on me here. The shed enclosed a complete station facility. It was also around a turntable and moderate engine servicing facilities up on the summit. In the 1960s, at least, the section house on the right was still standing. But between the 1950s and the 60s, when I first got to the summit, all the station facilities at the top had been torn down. You see all that was left at the time I first got up there in about 1969 or 70 in the sign on the highway, the gravel highway. Descending, going down around the legendary Ouray curve. And at the bottom, the division point of sergeants, where helper engines could be added or subtracted. And in 1969-70, again, it looked as if the train had left 20 minutes ago, except for the missing track. The water tank was still there. I pulled down the spout and water came out, let it go back up, water stopped. Depot still had the windows in it. Rio Grande signage was on the buildings. Most of this today, sadly, is gone, but not destroyed. The important buildings were moved to a museum village complex at Gunnison, about 20 miles to the west. But Sargent's no longer evokes railroading unless you know what once was there. At Gunnison, the line had a branch line network that went off to the north, which is actually where most of the freight came from. Stock was important on all the Rio Grande narrow gauge lines. You can see them loading sheep here, but the traffic that was good throughout the year was coal. And there were coal mines at both Crested Butte and Baldwin, north and a little bit west of Gunnison. And those mines kept the main line going over Marshall Pass, at least, until 1953. This little depot was the depot in Gunnison, actually built by the Denver South Park and Pacific. Some of you may have heard my program a year or so ago on the South Park line's western extension. Rio Grande bought the South Park remnants in the Gunnison area and used it to the end. Now, west of Gunnison, the line went into the canyon of the Gunnison River, known as the Black Canyon, one of the deepest and most spectacular river gorges in the West. And there were some remarkable landmarks in that canyon, most famously the Jepeta Falls and the Curacanti Needle. Now, both today can only be accessed by boat because hydroelectric dams have blocked the river in much, but not all, of the gorge. But there are places where you can still walk on the grade. And in fact, in normal non-COVID times, I'm going to kill a call here. Excuse me. Give me just a moment here. Silence this. There we go. Sorry about that. Look at this spot for just a moment and then compare it here. The National Park Service has incorporated the reservoir area that was flooded into the Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park. And you can walk about a mile down, it's 230 some steps, plus about a mile on the grade to a point where you can board a boat and cruise up to the Curacanti Needle and the Jepeta Falls. At least in non-COVID times, you can do that. Sadly, at the moment, the boat cruises are not running, but we'll give you some of the sights from them. This is the Jepeta Falls. This was one of the landmarks of the Rio Grande's long-term promotion of the narrow gauge empire. And the Curacanti Needle, which the Rio Grande promoted as aggressively as it did the Royal Gorge. You can see the lake in front of it. It's about 200 feet of water there. This summer, the Gunnison River drainage is apparently so low that another mile of the railway grade has come out, and the boat cruises are not running, again, mostly because of the impact of the pandemic, but also because of low water levels. Here's the dam that blocked the railway line. You can see the railway grade emerging from the dam. Just around the corner, the line left the canyon. The deepest part of the Black Canyon of the Gunnison to this day has no roads or trails through it. It can be seen only from the rim of the Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Monument. But the railway crossed this trestle and then it began to climb over Cerro Summit to get out into the sagebrush country on the far western boundary of Colorado. And the National Park Service has perched C-16 class 280, 278 on that trestle today with a short freight train. She's a little jewel. You wonder how they got it onto the trestle, and I've never had a full explanation whether the missing pieces were still there or they somehow managed to lower it down, but it makes a nice little freight and a good side. Now at Montrose, there was another junction. The narrow gauge main line continued off to the north and west to Grand Junction and eventually over the Utah mountains to Salt Lake City. But the circle for touring, went south to Ridgeway. And there at Ridgeway, there was a junction again. And you could either continue by branch line to the magnificent village of Ouray, and then by stagecoach and a secondary narrow gauge railway down to Silverton, or you could go west on the Rio Grande Southern Railway. Both were remarkable, and we'll try to trace as much as we can of both routes. This is Ouray, lying at the end of a box canyon. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world. And the one place in Colorado where the great genius of railway engineering of Colorado, the Russian self-trained engineer Otto Mears, actually couldn't figure out how to put a railroad. Mears started building wagon roads out of the San Luis Valley. As the fortunes of the mines in Colorado grew, there was a demand for easier transport than using wagons and horses. And Mears began building first toll roads of a high standard, and then in some cases selling the toll roads for railroads. The Marshall Pass line originally had been built as a road. Then he began simply building railroads from scratch, but at Ouray, there was about 8 miles up the canyon of the Uncompahgre River to a place called Albany, which he simply couldn't figure out how to get a railroad in. By 1893, just before the repeal of the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act, Mears had apparently decided that he would try to build an electric cog railway through the canyon, but it never happened. Instead, he built a 180-mile-long line around the 7-mile gap, the Rio Grande Southern. But first, we're going to follow the stagecoach road he did complete up the canyon, and then the remarkable Silverton Railroad, not to be confused with the Rio Grande Silverton branch, but Silverton Railroad that he built from Albany over the Red Mountain Pass and down to Silverton. This is the Canyon of the Uncompahgre above Ouray and looking down into the town and more of the canyon. The slash on the hillside is US Highway 550, known as the $1 Million Highway. Even in the 19th century, it was semi-paved with gravel that supposedly had $1 million in gold in every mile of the gravel. Believe that or not as you see fit, but it was again never converted to a railroad, and remains one of the most spectacular highways in the West today, fully paved now with normal macadam. Also, sadly, very much prone to avalanches in the winter. Monument here to 3 Colorado Highway Department snowplow drivers killed by a slide at the upper end of the canyon. And the 3 crosses are not to the snowplow drivers, but to the circuit riding Methodist preacher and his wife and daughter from Silverton, who also serviced the Ouray parish and who died in an avalanche in the canyon. This is the view of Mount Sneffels high above at sunset. This is sort of the landmark mountain of the whole gateway, North Gateway to the San Juan region. Now, this illustrates what he did succeed in building. That canyon ends basically at Albany, and you can see a line went through Ironton and up to Corkscrew Gulch, where it appears to have a switchback, but actually that wasn't a true switchback. That was a turntable in the middle of the main line. And we'll show you a picture of that in a moment. It's like something out of a model railroad that if you put it on your model railroad, they'd laugh at you. But the trains went up to the Corkscrew Gulch, and it was so precipitous that they turned car by car and engine by engine, the train on a turntable right in the middle of the main line. And the ruin of that turntable is still there. Again, we'll show you some pictures of it shortly. There was one traditional switchback up on Red Mountain Pass near the summit, and then a near switchback loop down to Chattanooga, and finally down to Silverton. And then you can see there's 2 other narrow gauge railways marked on this, which were also part of the Mears Empire, the Silverton, Gladstone, and Northerly, and the Silverton Northern Railroad, which also was supposed to have gone further. It was supposed to have gone over the range to a place called Lake City, but again, only a stagecoach route was ever completed above Eureka. So here we're on the Silverton Railroad ascending up to the Red Mountain Pass. And this today is one of the most beautiful auto roads in the world, but here's what the turntable looked like at Corkscrew Gulch. Covered over for reasons of avalanches in the winter. The line featuring the turntable was abandoned in 1926, but it is believed that the portion including the turntable actually wasn't used much after about the First World War. Now, this is what the turntable looked like in the 80s. These are not my photos. I could not locate my pictures of the turntable, which were taken in the 70s. But these were taken by a gentleman named Glenn Brewer, who was kind enough to let me use his pictures. And I've checked with locals in Ouray, and the ruins are still up there to this day. You can see it won't turn anymore because the pine tree has grown right out of the pit, but here's some more views of it. Absolutely amazing feat of engineering. And there's the Red Mountain from which the pass takes its name. It's actually rusty. Iron pyrites in it. One of the most remarkable mines in Colorado, the Idorado, which has an 8-mile-long underground tunnel completely going under the Rockies and coming out on the other side of the range at Telluride, was actually worked into the 1990s and could reopen. But on the right-hand side, we see a bit of the grade of the Silverton Railroad just up the summit of the Red Mountain Pass, again, well over 11,000 feet. You look down into the mining district far below, but on the left, there is a picture of what looks like a fairly modern mining building, and that indeed is the gateway to the Idorado mine, which goes completely through the range and comes out in another Box Canyon Valley on the west side at Telluride. This is the actual summit of the Red Mountain Pass, and on the right, you can see the grade descending down to a trestle that still, ruins of it at least were there in the 1960s. Same view when the railway was intact. The distance is the Chattanooga Loop down in the valley far below. One of Mr. Brewer's pictures on the left showing the descent to Chattanooga, and one of mine on the right. Now at Silverton, Mears again had a junction with 3 narrow gauge railways he controlled. The least known of them, but one that lasted to the very end of the 3 Mears lines, the Silverton, Gladstone, and Northerly. You can see it goes up to Gladstone, and at Gladstone, that's the one in the middle, there actually is active mining again to a limited degree today. On the right, the Silverton Northern, which went up to Animas Forks and Eureka. Animas Forks line actually had a Polar dining car on it at the peak of the 1890s, the Pollard Diner, Animas Forks. I tried for decades to buy a copy of its menu from the Colorado Road Museum. They had a cache of about 25 of them, and for decades, the Colorado Road Museum held an annual auction every year and sold those menus off in the auction. And I bid as high as $75, but I never got one. Never once succeeded in getting one. These are pictures on the Silverton Northern, which made it till 1942, at least the lower end of it. And the same pictures, these are from the late 70s, actually, a later trip of mine down to the region. Highs still across the open flats of the Animas River. This is, if you've ever been to Silverton on the Durango and Silverton, straight ahead if you had continued beyond Silverton. And you can see the ruins of the large mine and processing works there on the right. Doubleheader going up. One of the most photographed houses in Colorado on the right. Apparently that ruin has been stabilized somewhat now, but it's still there. The picture on the left is the railway grade nearing Animas Forks. The ghost town itself at Animas Forks. Now, again, the railway was supposed to have continued beyond here over Engineer Pass and down to Lake City, but Mears never finished it. The silver panic of 1893 intervened, and that was the end of narrow gauge railway construction pretty much for Colorado. The Jeep is not on what would have been the railroad grade. He did again complete a stagecoach road over the pass, passable Jeep road today. That's off to the left of the Jeep and downhill about probably 200 feet. But you can get over it with a decent four-wheel drive vehicle in summer, and amazing country up there. Silverton, Gladstone, and Northerly was the shortest of Mears lines, but again, quite spectacular. And as I mentioned a moment ago, there is actually a little bit of mining activity again up by Gladstone. This is how you got up to the main works there by tramway above the end of the railway line. Now, what most people think of as the Silverton Railroad is the Rio Grande Railroad's Silverton branch, which was the northwestern end of the narrow gauge main line from Durango, 45 miles up to Silverton. And these are pictures that I took almost exclusively in 1966 on what turned out to be the last ever Rocky Mountain Railroad Club excursion over the entire length of the Rio Grande narrow gauge main line, including the Silverton branch. And what makes these photos unduplicatable is that they ran photo run-bys on this trip that they would never do today. So we'll get you some spots that you can get to, but not by standing on the ground to get pictures unless you hiked in from a considerable distance. Engine 476, one of the three K-28s, the fast passenger so-called sport models. In that era, in the 60s, the Rio Grande would not run any of the larger narrow gauge engines, the K-36 and K-37 class engines on the Silverton branch. Today, that they are used there because the line has been heavily rebuilt and upgraded. These shots were actually taken in the 80s, and by this time, the Rio Grande was trying to find a buyer for the railroad, which it did. Today, the Silverton branch is the Silverton Railroad, Silverton, Durango and Silverton Narrow Gauge Railway. But it really, again, its history is deriving from the Rio Grande. The picture on the left looking down from the heights is from the Million Dollar Highway again, heading for the Molas Divide south of Silverton. One of the less known but kind of cool ways, if you want to see it both above and below, to ride the Silverton is to take the train in one direction and then the railway provides a motor coach to go back to Durango in the other direction. It allows you to get pictures like the one on the left if you don't have your own car, although obviously you don't get a round trip on the train either. Now, these pictures going through the Animas Canyon Narrows south of Durango would never be duplicated today for reasons of liability insurance worries, but we were given a run-by at an amazing spot in 1966 at least. This is Elk Park. They do run-bys here today on the occasional photographer special. The new Elk Park trestle on the left, you can barely see through the bridge. In the background, a wooden trestle, which was the original one, but had gotten undermined by flooding. And this had just opened the year before, or the run-bys in Elk Park. Looks like autumn, but actually this is May, and the aspen are just leafing out. And much like the trees here in New England, they give a hint of the gold color they'll have in the fall before they turn green for high summer. down the Animas River Canyon. Animas was really full in the spring of '66. In the distance, that's the bridge that marks the beginning of the High Line. On the left and on the right, the High Line itself. The railway is about 500 feet above the Rio de las Animas Perdidas, the River of Lost Souls, a legendary stretch of the Rio Grande narrow gauge system. Built this in one summer, and if you look carefully in the picture in the center under the engine, you can see they actually had to create an artificial right-of-way in some places by driving pilings into the hillside and then filling them in with ballast. It's held for over 100 years. This is Rockwood at the south end of the narrow section, the High Line. And finally, Durango. Now, one of the things that I was so lucky on this trip is that, as I mentioned, this excursion actually went over the full length of the narrow gauge main line, including the portion that was completely torn up in 1970 from Durango to Chama, New Mexico, where today's Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Road begins. These are the Durango yards, but shortly we'll take a trip over that lost section of the main line. But first, we've got to get around the missing 7 miles the way Otto Mears actually did it. And that's the Rio Grande Southern, 161 miles, plus about 20 miles back up on Ouray to Bridgeway, 180 miles of railroad to bridge a little over 7 mile gap. The Rio Grande Southern lasted for 60 years. At the beginning of its history, it was wildly successful, so much so that they printed passes for the swells out of solid silver. But then the Washington administration, in its infinite wisdom, repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1893. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act had required the US government to protect the currency with equivalent amounts of both gold and silver. And that created a huge artificial demand for silver, far beyond what would ever normally have been necessary. When that was repealed, the currency was then protected only by gold, and the silver mines in Colorado in particular virtually overnight collapsed. They didn't all shut, but enough shut down that the boom was over, and the boom never really returned as it had been. And the Rio Grande Southern staggered on, most of the time in receivership, truthfully for 70% or more of its history indirectly owned by the Rio Grande, which controlled it but didn't exactly merge with it, and eventually created a remarkable type of equipment called the Galloping Goose, which we'll look at in just a little while here. If you look at this, this is a setup of timetable pages, which actually shows the complete option to go via the Rio Grande Southern. If you look at the right-hand panel, that's the Rio Grande Southern option. It would have taken you 2 days to get from Durango to Denver, or vice versa, and included remarkable scenery en route all the way. Slight difference in the schedule in later years. This is a 1915 one, and by this time, for whatever reason, in the northbound direction, look on the right-hand panel, table number 19, the Rio Grande Southern has you leave Durango at 5:10 in the evening and then overnight in Dolores, Colorado, from 8:15 at night to 7:30 in the morning, but only in the northbound direction. Southbound, the train goes right through. Oddity. Never had a good explanation for that. Rio Grande Southern number 20 still exists. Rio Grande Southern crossed the Rockies twice, first over the Dallas Divide at just under 9,000 feet, and then over the main range at 10,222 on Lizardhead Pass. This is a shot taken in the very end in 1951, just before the abandonment. The engine on the right is a Rio Grande Mudhead, K27 class 282. Starting out of Ridgeway, beginning the ascent up to Dallas Divide. Again, the same country 30 years later. Mount Sneffels, again, the magnificent high 14,000 footer that is sort of the gateway to the San Juan Mountain region. Now, this is on the Dallas Divide summit, 9,000 feet, and the stock loading pen on the right is still there to this day. Hasn't served a stock car since 1950 or 51, but it's still, amazingly enough, standing in. Sunset in the winter over Dallas Divide and Mount Sneffels. The road in the foreground is actually the Rio Grande Southern Railway grade. At the foot of a very steep descent, the railway reached the San Miguel River and ascended up it to a junction at a place called Placer Junction. And if you look down in the canyon, you can see what looks like a narrow road beside the canyon, and that is the Rio Grande Southern's grade. Some pictures of it in the last years. Freight trains were heavy during World War II. There were uranium deposits in the area, and a vast amount of uranium was taken out for the project to develop the atomic bomb and moved over the Rio Grande Southern. One sort of last great moment of surging traffic, but it didn't sustain, it didn't last. Now, this is looking down to Placer Junction, and I apologize for the focusing problems here. I had to put a 300mm lens on. I didn't have a very high-speed film. But if you look on the left, you can see what looks like an old coach down in the valley. And in fact, that is the station for Placer Junction, where the main line split. The through line to Durango went off to the right, and most traffic actually went up to Telluride by continuing straight ahead. The station at Placer Junction had burned, and the Rio Grande Southern replaced it with a coach and an old baggage car. They're a little bit more visible on the right. They're gone today. There's not a trace of those left, but they were still there in the 60s and well into the 1970s. The branch line climbed up to another box canyon with a magnificent village in it, Telluride. And this is Telluride. Box Canyon, the background there, the mountain. If you look on the left, you can see some switchbacks on the mountainside. That's the Black Bear Road, which they only allow you to drive one way downhill. And over on the other side, on the Red Mountain Pass Road, where it turns off, there is a highway sign which literally says Black Bear Road to Telluride. You don't have to be crazy to drive this road, but it helps. That's also the range that the Idorado mine completely penetrates, going between Red Mountain Pass summit and the Telluride Valley. Rio Grande Southern Station at Telluride, which has variously been a restaurant and a brew pub, various other things in recent years, but is in very good condition. On the right is the unique part of the transport system today in Telluride. The village is a ski center as well as an historic mining village. And the ski resort is about 2,500 feet higher up the mountain above the town. And there's about a 2.5 mile long gondola lift which leads up to it, which incredibly is free to use. It's considered a part of the public transport system of Telluride, and it's one of the most spectacular rides in the West, and it's free. These are pictures from the gondola on the ascent up to the ski resort. Pretty amazing. And now, once again, the Black Bear Road. This is at the end of the Box Canyon, about 1.5 miles to the east of the town of Telluride. And you can see the waterfalls which bracket the Black Bear Road. Really magnificent, remarkable Box Canyon. Now, the main line back at Placer Junction turned to the right, headed south and west, and began a very steep ascent over the main range to Lizard Head Pass. The first picture on the left and the center one are on the Rio Grande Southern grade. The final one is on the Mountain Highway, which parallels it. The most notable landmark on this stretch was the remarkable trestle, which you can see in the middle picture here, in an area known as the Ophir Loop. Now, the Ophir Loop was not, in fact, a true loop, but let's start with the trestle. The trestle was so well built that when the Forest Service in the 1990s decided in its infinite wisdom that it was no longer safe and decided to blow it up, they literally had to blast it 3 times to make it fall down. Rio Grande Southern was, in some places at least, built for the ages. Sadly, that's gone, and it makes a long walk into it from either end. You can't go through as a through run anymore. And the central section just to the right of the trestle is not possible to access with vehicles any longer. Now here's the Ophir Loop, which was not at the summit, but was about 3 miles beyond that trestle. And this was actually an extremely tight U-curve, horseshoe curve section with lots of trestling in it, but didn't quite form a full loop. Here's a map that kind of shows it. You can see it down in the lower right-hand corner. Magnificent and spectacular, to put it mildly. Above this, the line continued on a steep ascent to Trout Lake. These are some pictures of Trout Lake, and the backside of the range, the far side of this range, would have been Chattanooga, where I mentioned the Sylvan Railroad had its own tight loop. You can see on the right, this picture I took in the 1970s, There was a coaling facility and water tank at the station, all still standing here, and they are all still standing to this day. This is Trout Lake again, still not up to the summit of Lizard Pass. We're up at around 9,500 feet here, but we're not up to the summit. Little trestle, I drove my VW across in 1969, but I must have been out of my mind. It's still standing, but you couldn't drive anything across it today. And finally, opening up on top of the world, the summit of Lizard Head Pass is like being on an open plateau. And this is the actual summit of the Rio Grande Southern. There was a snow shed up on the summit, and we can see a galloping goose arriving, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Very near the end shot, one stock car sort of sums up how bad the traffic demand was at the end. There's the Lizard Head. That's the Lizard Head of Lizard Head Pass, 10,222. Now, in the 1930s, the Rio Grande Southern realized that if they were going to survive at all, they had to stop using steam engines except when absolutely necessary. But they had a lucrative mail contract that they needed to preserve, which meant they needed to run a reliable passenger service every day, at least except Sunday, and they ran it every day. And their chief engineer came up with the idea of adapting highway vehicles to run on rails. Initially, they built this sort of truck-like vehicle, which is actually a reproduction of it, and it worked. And then they created, using a variety of passenger cars and bus bodies, a group of 8 rail cars, motors, as they would be called by railroads if they were larger vehicles, that squeaked and groaned and shook as they went over the line and became known affectionately as galloping geese. And all 8, except for number 1, survived to this day, and number 1's been recreated. These handled again almost all of the passenger service from the 1930s to the end of operations in 1951. And in later years, the freight and baggage compartment at the back, a number of them was adapted to handle much larger numbers of passengers than just a little bit of school bus body on the front of this vehicle. This is the goose at Rico, as you descend down from the summit, and Dolores. Remember, they talked about overnighting at Dolores. This is actually in front of Dolores Station. And this is one where, again, the freight back part of the car has been converted into passenger seating. And you can actually ride for about 200 yards on the Rio Grande Southern on this goose, at least most of the time in the summer. It does go over to Durango and Silverton and to the Cumbres and Toltec periodically to operate. And then it can really stretch its, can't say legs exactly, but its wheels. But most of the time it runs on about 250 feet of track at the front of the Dolores Station. Now, between Dolores and Durango, there was yet one more summit, sort of unnamed summit, Manco Summit, no consequence, scenery-wise, over the desert part of Colorado on the west end of the state. And these are some pictures on approaching that last summit. In Durango, Rio Grande Southern shared the yards with the Rio Grande, and now we'll travel east on the narrow gauge main line. In the late 1930s, the Rio Grande made a real effort to stay in the passenger business on the narrow gauge, at least briefly. In 1936, they upgraded a number of coaches with reclining seats. They converted a number of Polar cars to have small dining sections on them, and they were diner Pollars thereafter. And they ran a name train, the Shivano, from Salida to Gunnison. By then they had dropped in 1936 rail-operated passenger service west of Gunnison, but they were still doing it there. And on the main line, the San Juan Express, much beloved, especially by the Indians in western Colorado on the Apache and Ute reservations, because the dining car steward would hand down ice cream to the Indian kids, and most of the time he wouldn't charge them either for it. The San Juan Express lasted until 1951, so these pictures are definitely not from the era of that train, although they are equipment that ran on that train. The Polar car Alamosa has been converted back from a coach to a Polar car by the Durango and Silverton today, but passenger service after 1951, on the main line at least, from Durango over to Chama and on to Alamosa, was only excursions, but there were frequent excursions, and for many years, like clockwork, there was an excursion in May, which both provided an opportunity for the Rocky Mountain Road Club to showcase the whole line and brought the equipment over to Durango for the summer. And again in the fall, usually sponsored by the Illini Railroad Club out of Illinois, which in the end brought the equipment back to Alamosa for the winter. although the Rio Grande had run deadhead moves before and after each of those trips as well. 1966 was the last year the Rio Grande did that. And again, although none of us knew it, I took these pictures on what turned out to be the last spring excursion. They did run that fall. And then that was it for pasture service, with one exception. In 1968, just before the line was officially abandoned, the Rio Grande ran a special excursion for the National Park Service, which was considering acquiring the whole main line from Durango all the way to Alamosa. But sadly, in the end, it didn't go ahead with it. Instead, the states of Colorado and New Mexico formed a railroad authority, which bought the most spectacular part of the narrow gauge main line over Cumbres Pass from Chama to Antonito, which runs to this day as the Cumbres and Toltec. But the rest of the narrow gauge main line was abandoned. So these are shots which could not be duplicated again today. But we're also going to take a quick look at how the Rio Grande, starting at least in the 1940s, began to put itself out of the narrow gauge business. The Rio Grande got permission from the Colorado regulatory authorities to form something called the Rio Grande Motorway, which initially provided bus service on routes that no longer justified a train. But later, the Rio Grande also got permission to parallel its rail lines, in some cases, with Rio Grande Motorways buses. And if you look at the timetable panel 6 on the left of the timetable panels, you can see that the San Juan Express, for example, in this schedule left Alamosa at 7 o'clock in the morning, arrived Durango at 4:05 in the afternoon. But if you didn't really want to take all day going over, you could take the Rio Grande Motorway bus at 6:30 in the morning and be in Durango by 11:30 in the morning. The motorway also provided extensive truck service, and the truck operation actually lasted into the 1980s. And again, the Rio Grande Motorway method of impacting traffic was used on branch lines all over the Rio Grande system. Rio Grande Motorways eventually became part of Continental Trailways, which had actually in turn spun out of Burlington Trailways. And Continental Trailways is sadly gone, although the Trailways name as a franchise does continue in some parts of the United States. So we're heading out of Durango, heading east. There was a very steep ascent almost immediately out of the Durango yards. This is the pictures on the left here. At the top of this grade, there was a junction, and a branch line about 40 miles long went down to Farmington, New Mexico. Now, we did not ride that branch in '66, alas. The Rio Grande had embargoed it for pasture service, but it turned out to be the most important piece of the narrow gauge network after World War II, because there were extensive developments of oil deposits and of coal in the Farmington area. And they produced one last great surge of traffic for the narrow gauge system. The Farmington branch uniquely had originally been built, opening in 1905, as a standard gauge line. And in the 1920s was shrunk down to narrow gauge, 1923, when the Rio Grande realized that they would never get around to converting the rest of the main line to connect to it. But so it was standard gauge, then narrow gauge, and then sadly after 1968, nothing. But we'll stick with the main line. The highlight of the Durango to Chama portion of the route was the line through Apache Canyon on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, which straddles the Colorado-New Mexico border. Oddly enough, about 8 miles of entirely new line had been built in the early 1960s to get around a new dam on the San Juan River in this region. I don't have any pictures left of that stretch, alas, but these are shots in the Apache Canyon. I have been told that you can drive a car on the grade through this area now, but I haven't been down there to do it. And you do apparently need permission from the Apache to do it. But again, there was some write-up in trains in the last few months suggesting that it is possible to take a passenger car along the grade in this area. All of this is abandoned today. This was the last eastbound spring excursion train in May of '66. Now, the Continental Divide itself, the point beyond which all waters flow either to the Atlantic or the Pacific, is not on the crest of the San Juan mountain range in the distance. It's actually out in the middle of this open sagebrushy desert, about 20 miles west of Chama. And we're ascending to it on the right, almost to the summit of it. It's just beyond the trestle on the left panel here. And then we go into Chama. And this is where the line is intact to this day, operating as the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. But this is number 483 again on the Rio Grande operated excursion. We had a helper to Cumbres Summit, the sustained 4% grade out east of Chama for over 13 miles, and all trains of any consequence have to be double-headed. Here we are beginning the serious ascent. Again, sustained 4% grade. First trestle, however, Loboto trestle, the helper is always cut off and run light across the trestle, and then the main engine pulls the rest of the train across it. They simply don't think this trestle can take the weight of two engines at the same time. Continuing the ascent towards Cumbres. This is Windy Point. Just around the curve to the left ahead is Cumbres Pass, the crest of the Rio Grande narrow gauge system, still intact portions at least. 10,015 feet. They claim the highway elevation is a little higher. The snow shed here is now gone, largely, but the small station building still stands, and trains do detach their helpers here. Our helper was needed down in the Alamosa yards, and she followed us running light down that day. But first, of course, the helper was cut off, and it was time to stretch her legs and look at the snow shed. This is the Tanglefoot curve, very sharp curve just below the summit, and the helper was following right on our markers almost. Now, again, an example of a run-by they would probably never do today. We were allowed to detrain and get on the cliffs by the Cascade Canyon Viaduct here and get pictures of the Cascade Canyon Viaduct with the train going over it. Fantastic, unforgettable run-by. We've just skipped one of the main stops on today's Cumbres and Toltec, which is the section house at Osier, which at least in 1966 was in semi-ruined condition. Today, that's the lunch stop for the Cumbres and Toltec. It's been developed into an elaborate restaurant. They had a fire there last year, but it has been fixed. Instead, we'll look at this monument, which is rather unique. This was the monument to the assassination of President Garfield. The railway construction workers got the word as they were just building the line past the Toltec Gorge that Garfield had been shot and had died. He lingered most of the summer of 1881, but died. They built this rather moving monument to him at the point where you, in the days of the San Juan Express at least, could get off and the train would wait for about 5 minutes while you could look down 900 feet to the Rio de los Pinos below the River of the Pines, 900 feet directly below you. If you look at the lower right-hand corner photo, this is from a few miles further down the Los Pinos Canyon. The gray mass in the center of this picture is the canyon where we were, and you can see the railway line as a straight slash on the mountainside on that lower left picture. We're now on the much less dramatic, but in terms of grade, but much more extended descent over the Rio de los Pinos Canyon to Antonito. It's the area known as the Mud Tunnel. And on the right, the Bighorn Curves. And ahead, the San Luis Valley, the great intramountain valley in Colorado with the San Juan Mountains on the west side and the Sangre de Cristo Range on the east. About 100 miles long and 25 to 50 miles wide, but completely surrounded by the mountains with a base elevation of over 8,000 feet. At Antonito, the line had a junction with the branch line that went down to Santa Fe, New Mexico. That was torn out in 1941. The main line continued north 26 miles to Alamosa. This was the speedway. The K-28 class passenger engines were known to get up to 60 miles an hour on this stretch. There was only one curve from Antonito to Durango, and I always called it the Lionel line stretch because it was the last piece of the Rio Grande narrow gauge system to also have mainline standard gauge rail in it. Today, there are still bits and pieces you can find on the line down to Antonito from Alamosa of the third rail, the center rail, but 90% of it has been lifted. And you could see even here in 66, if you look at the passing track on the left, that the narrow gauge rail was gone. This is La Jara, and just off ahead is Manassas, where Jack Dempsey came from, the Manassas Mauler. Coming into the yards at Alamosa, this is where until 1951, you would have come down from Denver on an overnight sleeping car train, which got to Alamosa about 5 o'clock in the morning. You could stay in the sleeper, or the connecting train to Durango left at 7. The yards here included major shop buildings, and there were narrow gauge engines everywhere in the 60s, in various stages of decay and disintegration, but virtually all of them have survived, either on the Rio Grande's owned Durango and Silverton, now this independent Durango and Silverton Narrow Gauge Railway, or in the Cumbres and Toltec, or at various museums around Colorado. And the shops actually reopened for a few years under Iowa Pacific ownership for the Rio Grande Scenic Railroad. I'm not sure what the status is now. Omnitrax just purchased the Rio Grande Scenic lines down in the San Luis Valley last week, but the sale hasn't been fully completed yet. So one last look, after 1951, could not have continued straight up the valley back to Salida because that portion of the narrow gauge line was abandoned in 51. But the Rio Grande had built a second way into Alamosa in the late 1890s over La Vita Pass, and then later actually rebuilt the line completely to a new alignment about 3 miles south of the original narrow gauge route. This went past the Great Sand Dunes, which had built up with the endless blowing of the winds against the Sangre de Cristo mountain range, and again over a magnificent pass called La Vita Pass. And for a few years at least, the Iowa Pacific Company was running excursion trains over the pass for one wonderful year with a former Southern Pacific 282 steam engine doing the power, most of the time with diesels, including some very stylish F units painted up in their colors. Sangre de Cristos, again, the Blood of Christ range, and here the east side of the line. And so with that, we complete our run around the narrow gauge circle. We would have gone up to Walsenburg and back up to Denver on the overnight sleeper. From 51 to 53, briefly, the Rio Grande ran a day train over that route. After that, it was buses. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll be happy to take some questions. Eric, do we have any feedback?
I have nothing in the chat as of the moment, Carl, but I want to start by saying thank you. I've actually enjoyed that thoroughly, where I actually had time to sit and watch it versus the speed session we did last night.
Yeah, I think we took twice the time tonight, if not more. So, well, if everyone is satisfied, I am. Would love to come and do something else for you. I hope everybody enjoyed it. You can still do, again, over 100 miles of this by train to this day, the 64 miles from Magneto to Chama, then the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic, and the 45 miles from Durango up to Silverton are intact, well, and prosperously operating, and worth a special trip and then some to enjoy. And if you've got a four-wheel drive vehicle, you can chase a lot of the lines I showed you. But quite frankly, a regular passenger car, as long as you drive sanely, can go over the Marshall Pass line, for example, with no problems whatsoever.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Rich Gibson. I'm called in from Golden, Colorado.
Hi, Rich. Yeah.
So it's kind of neat to see this. I've been out here a few years. I also did my PhD thesis work along the Silverton line. So I just wanted to say nice presentation. It was really fun.
Thank you. I was a DU graduate in '69, and so had a lot of connection, and worked for the State Employment Service as late as 1981. So I was in the area for many, many years. And then after that, I ran a tour company called Rail Travel Center, which ran tours by train all over the world. And consistently over 30 years, our best-selling product was a circle tour of Colorado, picking off some 8 or 10 different railroads, depending upon what was in service at the time. And we did that from 1983 until 2017.
Cool. And just one comment. I also volunteer at the Colorado Railroad Museum, and we have 3 of the geese all operational out here that we run occasionally.
You've got a Rio Grande Southern engine, and of course you've got
we got number 20.
Yep, you've got number 20, the one I showed a number of slides of, and you've got a K37. You've got an astounding collection.
Yeah, it's nice.
I have dropped, I'm sure, many thousands of dollars on the book sales from the Colorado Railroad Museum over the decades.
Yeah, keep an eye out for those menus.
Yeah, but a menu, yeah, there hasn't been an auction for a few years, at least not one that's been made aware of to us back on the East Coast, who are long-term members.
No, they're not. They decided the auctions were too hard, so we're having yearly book sales at this point.
Yeah. Somebody, again, had gone through a drawer or something down in Durango and found a cache of these menus. There was about 25 of them. And again, it was a regular feature of the auction every year. And I thought for sure when I went to $75, I'd get one, but I never made it. Never got it. I collect dining car menus, as you might imagine, from this esoteric sideline. But nice to talk to you, and enjoy time in Golden. Again, you got to remind yourself that amazing things can happen. The Georgetown Loop came back from the dead.
Absolutely.
Electric rail service back to Golden. I mean, this is a
Como.
remarkable world we live in. Yes, steam at Como. My other
Rebuilding of
slideshow
Como
I
is
showed the
pretty
group a year or
amazing.
two ago is of the followed the Denver South Park and Pacific and the Colorado Southern narrow gauge system. And it included pictures I took again by breaking into the roundhouse in 1969, quietly snuck in. And in 1,000 years, I would never have imagined that a steam engine would run and live in there again. But there it is.
Yep.
Carl, this is Andrew Davison. I appreciate the presentation. I was wondering, because this is so interesting in terms of the history of how these lines were built and how they evolved over time, could you, or I think it was Alan that was just speaking, recommend one or two books that are really good about the history of this era and the construction of these lines and how they played out?
Yeah, just give me 1 minute. I'm going to disappear for a second to be back with a book.
This is Roger Wilby. I was in Durango in April and was in the shop where they were repairing the locomotives, and it was very interesting. Went up to Silverton and Telluride, and they were repairing the track at that time. They didn't give passenger tours. Quite a few pictures of the locomotives and so on, and the Galloping Goose. Quite an operation.
Yeah, I went off to grab a book because I wanted to be sure I got the title right. This has, I believe, unfortunately just gone out of print, but I'm sure it could be obtained from Amazon. The best one-volume history of all the Colorado railroads that I ever found, and this is in 50 years of looking for them, is a book called Railroads of Colorado by Claude Wiatrowski, spelled Wiatrowski. And it's extraordinary. I don't know if I'm still on Zoom here, or I can get a picture of this onto the screen. See if I can get this to show up. Just a minute here. No, I seem to have been lost as video, but Railroads of Colorado, and see if it's on it, if it's going to be obtained off Amazon.
There's also the famous Lucius Beebe book, Narrow
There's
Gauge of the Rockies.
lots of, yeah, the Beebe book is, Beebe is a wonderful writer, but he was notorious for making up facts when he didn't have the right stuff. And, which he often didn't. He wasn't terribly worried about that sort of thing. Yeah, it's available, but they're trying to get $100 for a new copy, but you can get used copies from $15.63 from Amazon.
Awesome.
And
Perfect. Thank you, Carl.
that is a fabulous one-volume, accurate, well-researched study of the Colorado railroads. The Colorado Railroad Museum itself has put out what they call annuals, although sometimes it's been more than annual, between editions, which have covered virtually every imaginable topic in Colorado railroading that you can dream of. But again, for a complete comprehensive coverage of all of the Colorado narrow gauge and standard gauge lines in one volume, I have never found a better book than the one Railroads of Colorado. And, again, it's certainly a used copy would be no problem. Sadly, it went out of print after being in print for a very long time.
Mhm.
There is also a book for if you want to go hunting down the abandoned grades, which is also out of print, but probably could be found, called Tracking the Ghost Railroads of Colorado. Tracking the Ghost Railroads of Colorado. Let me see if I can find a copy of that on Amazon. It also was in print for decades, but yeah, there are it's up on Amazon, but currently nobody has a copy. It's by Robert Ormes, O-R-M-E-S. He tells you how to get to all of these abandoned grades and then the condition they were in, but the book hasn't been reissued since the 1970s. So of course the descriptions are unreliable. For example, he will tell you that you can still drive over the Moffett Road across Rollins Pass above the Moffett Tunnel. And sadly, the Needles Eye Tunnel on that line road has caved in and you can't do that anymore. But it is still very useful for finding grades. And if you're driving a road in Colorado and you see what looks like an abandoned railroad grade next to you, his book will tell you what it was. But currently Amazon doesn't have an actual copy of it. But-
eBay can come in handy for that type of thing
Yep,
too. So
Very much
yeah.
so.
Great. Thank you, Carl. Really appreciate it.
Yep.
Great presentation.
Hello, Carl. Can you hear me?
I can.
This is Al Butler in Waltham. In
Hi, Al.
June of 1966, Illini Railroad Club ran another trip
Did they?
up to Durango and Silverton. And at that time, we did do the Farmington Ranch.
They let you go down Farmington?
Yes, we did. It was,
That will require me to correct some narration then, because I was of the impression that their trip was the one in the fall that year.
no, that was June of 66.
Oh, I believe you. If you were on it, you'd have to know. So, but that's interesting. That would have been only a week or two after what we did, actually, I suspect.
Yeah, that was run by Maury Klebo.
Yeah, in those days, the Silverton Branch excursion trains didn't start Memorial Day weekend. They started in the middle to late part of June. So it would have been easy enough to have run a second trip that year. That's fascinating because the Rio Grande guys who were on just swore up and down that the Farmington line is too bad. We can't go down there anymore. But that's what they did with the whole route after 66. They claimed everything was unsafe after 66, even though they had actually put a bunch of ties in and done a bunch of work on it. We went by all kinds of work units on the trip in May where they were getting ready to do track work. But thank you. I appreciate that. I will correct myself on that in the future.
Yeah, that trip actually started out of Chicago on the Burlington route with the
Yep.
Honda steam locomotive as far as Galesburg.
Yep.
And then we continued on, of course, eventually to Denver and down to
Did you go
Alamo.
down to Alamosa by rail with the
Oh, yeah.
train? They
Yeah.
got you all the way down to Alamosa. Fantastic.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we went over La Vita Pass at night.
Yep.
I never did see it either way because we went at night both directions. I finally got over it, of course, later on with when
Rio Grande Scenic. Yeah,
Rio
it's
Grande Scenic got running
nor
out.
had I, but I was astounded at how beautiful it was when I finally got to ride it. I was just blown away by how beautiful it was in the daytime. And if one hopes Omnitrax becomes willing to run excursions or somebody else turns up willing to do it, it would be a wonderful experience again to go on that again.
Yes, it certainly would.
Very
Certainly
little
would.
remarked upon, but it was fantastically scenic.
Uh-huh, yeah.
And the engine, the steam engine, the one year they ran the steam engine, put a hell of a show on coming up, especially on the east side on the return. Very steep grades and really had to work. Lots of stacked
Absolutely.
on.
In fact, I'm just checking now. It was June 16th, 1966 that we did the Farmington Ranch.
About 2 weeks after our trip.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so we were lucky.
Yeah, all of us were.
Yeah.
The West End in particular, it's all gone. I mean, I've driven on parts of the West End as far as Pagosa Junction, but I never tried to go through the canyon. And again, apparently you can parallel it all the way now, although I suspect you'd want to have a four-wheel drive to do it.
Well, this was a fascinating presentation. Thanks very much, Carl.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Carl?
Yep.
I'm Colin, a member of the Four City Railroad Club.
Yep.
I actually visited the Cumbres and Toltec and the Durango and Silverton during my graduation in June of 2017. And it was a great experience
Yeah, they're fabulous.
for me to see all this beautiful scenery.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Which one did you prefer? Which one did you like the best
between
in terms of
Durango
scenery?
and Chama. I would suggest that the Cumbres and Toltec has fantastic scenery, and it's the longest narrow gauge railroad out of all of the other railroads.
You and I are in complete agreement. I love the Silverton line, but I think that Cumbres and Toltec is much more varied, and the sustained magnificence of that line is unmatched. I mean, it just goes on and on. Amazing scenery on that
This is
route.
the boundary between Colorado and New Mexico 11 times.
Yeah, they didn't worry about the boundary line when they were laying that out. they followed the rim of that gorge of the Rio de los Pinos Canyon. And of course, if you ever get to go in late September, the fall color along that canyon is out of this world.
Hmm.
It's
Interesting.
all aspen trees down in the gorge, and the last 2 weeks of September, generally, they are just amazing.
They sure are. And I wish to go back to see those narrow gauge railroads again. If
Well, and of course, additional ones that exist,
get a chance
not
to
so
do
long,
so.
but are spectacular, as well as the Georgetown Loop, of course, up by Denver, which is narrow
that was
gauge.
the Colorado and Southern.
Yep, and at Leadville, although it's been standard gauge, the Leadville, Colorado and Southern heading up from Leadville towards the pass, where the Climax mine is also fantastically scenic and was originally part of the Denver, South Park and Pacific narrow gauge.
It was a really great presentation and I really liked it, sir.
Thank you. Glad you
I
enjoyed it.
must say, I am very impressed
say-
about the narrow gauge business on the Rio Grande.
They, again, it's amazing it lasted as long as it did. I mean, that's the best thing you can say about it. That it held out for so many decades is remarkable. But it's also true that after World War II, the Rio Grande wanted out and successfully basically got rid of everything, except the Durango and Silverton, which they admitted they were making money on, that it was profitable, but they didn't want to run it. And they sold it well because it is very much viable to this day.
It sure is. Thank you, Carl.
Anyone else?
Thank you, Carl. I'm Sam Powers from Maine. It brought back so many memories. You know, I just did the Cumbres and Toltec and Durango and Silverton in 2018, but it just brings in, you know, I'm really glad to see pictures of what it used to be like. So
Yeah,
you're one in a million to bring. To
Yeah,
do
what's
what
kind
you've
of
done.
fun about the pictures from the 66 trip is it's all of the equipment that today is captive on the Silverton branch back on the main line that it was originally built to run over. The Cumbres and Toltec has gradually over the decades built a remarkable fleet of reproduction pasture cars and has great looking trains, but they actually only own 4 or 5 pasture cars that once belonged to the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande understandably retained its fleet because they had the profitable branch line service on the Silverton line. But you would never see any of those cars today again on Cumbres Pass because there's 60 miles of track missing, basically. Can't get there.
Yeah, well, I rode outside in the gondola car for the entire trip, and it was in the fall with all the aspen trees and yellow. It was fantastic. So
Yeah.
thanks again, Carl. I really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Yeah, this is Len Batchelder.
Hi, Len.
I rode the Durango. My wife and I rode the Durango and Silverton and the Cumbres and Toltec several years ago. Loved them both. I would agree with the person who said the Cumbres and Toltec was the more scenic of the two.
Both are wonderful. The 45-mile long canyon on the Silverton line is a marvel, but it's a kind of a single milieu, whereas the Cumbres and Toltec gives you high desert,
Yeah.
mountain passes, narrow gorges, great sweeping vistas. It's really quite astounding. And the engines really work on the Cumbres and Toltec, particularly going east, but also westbound up out of Alamosa and at Nito up that first big hill.
The other thing I did back in the early 60s, I had to go to a business convention in Denver. And I rented a car in Denver and drove over to Leadville. And I chased the freight from Leadville to Climax and back. At that time, it was the last steam engine operated by a Class 1 railroad in
Wow.
the United States.
Wow. I'm going to change the subject just slightly. I just, for instance, clicked on one of the listings for tracking the ghost railroads in Colorado up on Amazon. And even though it didn't show any price on the opening screen, it actually brought up 5 copies of the book from a low of $15 to a high of $33. So in fact, tracking the ghost railroads of Colorado could be obtained through Amazon right now.
Awesome. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah, I should have been more intuitive the first time, but usually on the opening screen, they show you a price, but
Right.
when you clicked on it, up it came. So they
Nice.
do
Carl,
have it.
Carl, I just want to jump in real quick. I got to run, but I'll leave the Zoom up for anybody who wants to keep asking questions. But I
Yeah.
did want to just thank you for presenting to us tonight. Again, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and especially where, like we mentioned, I had a little more time to enjoy it versus the speed show we saw last night. But again, I want to thank you for presenting to us tonight, and to everybody else, have a good night, and we'll see you next month.
And I'm actually going to have to sign out also. So everyone, good to do this with you. I've enjoyed it, and I hope I can present to you again.
Well,
Thank you very much, Carl.
We enjoyed it.
Good night.
Take care.
Good night.